humble serving maid with only copper coins to her name dared speak against a powerful lord's decision that would doom thousands, and what happened next changed the entire kingdom. Before we begin, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Lord Edmund Blackthorne stood frozen in his ornate chamber, the golden quill trembling between his fingers as he stared down at the treaty document spread across his mahogany desk. The parchment bore the crimson seals of King Harold himself, its elegant script demanding nothing less than his signature to seal the fate of countless souls. The agreement was simple, yet monstrous. Spare the nobility from Lord Aldrich the Cruel's invasion by offering up hundreds of peasant families for conscription into his merciless army. The weight of political pressure crushed down upon Edmund's shoulders like stones in a sack. Every lord in the kingdom had already voiced their eager support for the treaty, viewing common lives as nothing more than coins to be spent for their own safety. The king's patience wore thin with each passing hour, and whispers of treason already began circulating about Edmund's unusual delay. Suddenly, the soft whisper of footsteps echoed from behind him. Edmund's heart lurched as he spun around, expecting to find a royal messenger bearing threats or perhaps guards come to drag him before the throne. Instead, his eyes fell upon the most unlikely figure imaginable. Marian, a humble serving maid whose simple brown dress and calloused hands marked her station as clearly as any noble's crest proclaimed theirs. She stood near the doorway like a sparrow that had wandered into a hawk's nest, her eyes wide with terror, yet blazing with determination that seemed to light the very air around her. For what felt like an eternity, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them like a battlefield where two armies size each other up before the charge. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the strength of mountains and the authority of angels, Marian spoke the words that would echo through the halls of history. "My lord, sign not this paper." The golden quill slipped from Edmund's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the stone floor with a sound like thunder in the sudden stillness. He stared at this common girl who possessed nothing but her moral convictions, yet wielded them with more power than any sword or crown. Her simple words had just shattered the careful walls he had built around his conscience, forcing him to confront the terrible choice that lay before him. How had this moment come to pass? How had a mere servant gained knowledge of the kingdom's most guarded secrets? And why did her soft-spoken challenge carry more weight than all the king's threats and all the noble schemes combined? As Edmund gazed into Marian's eyes, he saw something that had been missing from his world of privilege and power, the pure light of righteousness that feared no earthly authority when innocent lives hung in the balance. 3 days before that fateful confrontation, Lord Edmund Blackthorne had been an entirely different man. He moved through his castle like a king in his own domain, draped in silk and velvet, his every whim attended to by a small army of servants who scurried about like mice before a cat. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored light across marble floors that had never known the touch of common feet. Edmund's day began as it always did, with hot bread baked by hands he'd never seen, wine poured by servants whose names he'd never learned, and reports delivered by advisors who told him only what they thought he wished to hear. The kingdom faced growing threats from Lord Aldrich the Cruel, whose armies pressed ever closer to their borders. But these concerns felt as distant to Edmund as storms on far-off seas. In the great hall, surrounded by his fellow nobles, Edmund participated in discussions about the crisis with the detached interest of a man studying pieces on a chessboard. The lord spoke of peasants as if they were livestock to be counted and moved at will. When someone mentioned the possibility of conscription, Edmund nodded thoughtfully, never pausing to consider the faces behind such cold calculations. His world was one of privilege without responsibility, power without purpose. He owned vast lands worked by people he regarded as little more than part of the landscape. Their harvests filled his coffers, their labor maintained his comfort, yet he knew nothing of their struggles, their hopes, or their fears. To Edmund, the common folk existed as a vague concept, rather than real human beings with beating hearts and loving families. The afternoon brought entertainments that would have fed a village for months, elaborate feasts where more food was wasted than many families saw in a year. Edmund laughed at jesters' jokes while children in his own lands went to bed hungry. He wagered gold coins on dice games while families in nearby cottages counted copper pennies like precious jewels. As evening fell, Edmund retired to his luxurious chambers surrounded by tapestries worth more than most people's homes. He possessed everything that money could purchase, yet felt a strange emptiness that all his wealth could not fill. Something was missing from his life, though he could not name what it might be. His days blended together in meaningless comfort, each one identical to the last. That night, as he lay upon silk sheets beneath a canopy of gold thread, Edmund stared at the ceiling and wondered why his grand life felt so small. He commanded respect through fear, inspired loyalty through rewards, and maintained order through force. Yet somewhere deep in his soul, a voice whispered that true nobility meant something more than birthright and bank accounts. Little did he know that in just 3 days, a humble maid with courage greater than armies would show him what real honor looked like. As Marian guided Edmund through the winding streets back toward the castle gates, her gentle words about daily struggles and simple hopes echoed in his mind like church bells that refused to stop ringing. When she finally pointed him toward the familiar stone walls of his home, Edmund found himself reluctant to part ways with this extraordinary woman who had shown him such unexpected kindness. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. "You have saved me from more than you know." Marian smiled, her face lighting up like sunrise over wheat fields. "Everyone needs help sometimes, good sir. May fortune smile upon your journey." She disappeared back into the maze of narrow streets, leaving Edmund standing before his castle gates like a man awakening from a vivid dream. The guards recognized him, despite his disheveled appearance, and rushed to escort him inside, their concerned voices a distant buzzing in his ears, but sleep would not come that night. Edmund lay upon his silk sheets, staring at the ornate ceiling while Marian's face haunted his thoughts. Her simple act of sharing bread with a stranger had struck him like lightning, illuminating corners of his soul that had remained dark for years. When had anyone last shown him genuine kindness without expecting favor or reward in return? The next morning found Edmund making excuses to wander the castle's lower levels. He claimed to be inspecting food quality and servant efficiency, but his true purpose was catching glimpses of the maid who had touched his heart so unexpectedly. From shadowed alcoves and hidden doorways, he watched the daily rhythm of castle life unfold with new eyes. There she was, Marian working in the kitchens with quiet dedication, her movements graceful despite the endless demands placed upon her. Edmund observed how she shared her own food portions with hungrier companions, how she helped an elderly scullery maid struggling with heavy pots, how she treated every person with the same gentle respect she had shown him in the streets. When the head cook berated Marian harshly for a minor mistake, a dropped ladle that spilled soup across stone floors, Edmund felt an unfamiliar surge of protective anger rise in his chest. The contrast between Marian's pure heart and the scheming courtiers who surrounded him daily became as clear as mountain air. He began questioning everything about his privileged existence, the shallow relationships built on mutual advantage, the political maneuvering that consumed his days, the complete disconnection from the people whose labor supported his luxury. It all felt hollow now, like beautiful fruit rotted from within. The castle servants noticed their lord's unusual interest in kitchen affairs, but attributed it to noble eccentricity. Meanwhile, Edmund struggled with growing awareness that despite all his wealth and power, he had never witnessed such authentic goodness. This humble maid possessed more genuine nobility than anyone who sat at the royal court. The kingdom's crisis deepened like gathering storm clouds when Lord Aldrich the Cruel's latest demands arrived at court with all the subtlety of a mailed fist. The messenger who delivered the parchment bore scars across his face and trembled as he spoke, clear evidence of his master's reputation for dealing harshly with those who displeased him. In the great hall, King Harold unrolled the document with hands that shook slightly despite his attempts to maintain royal composure. The terms were brutally simple: either provide Lord Aldrich with 500 able-bodied peasants for his army within a fortnight, or face total war against forces that had already crushed 3 neighboring kingdoms. Edmund sat among his fellow lords as they debated the treaty with the cold calculation of merchants haggling over grain prices. Lord Blackwood spoke first, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never swung a sword in anger or felt hunger gnaw at his belly. "The choice seems clear, Your Majesty. Better to sacrifice a few hundred peasants than risk our entire kingdom falling to Aldrich's brutality." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled nobility like wind through wheat fields. Lord Hartwell nodded sagely, his jeweled fingers drumming against the oak table as he added his support. "Indeed, the common folk exist to serve the realm's greater good. What purpose do they serve, if not to protect those of us who bear the true burden of leadership?" Edmund found himself participating in these discussions, but Marion's gentle face haunted his thoughts like a ghost that refused to rest. As his peers spoke of peasant lives as acceptable casualties, he kept remembering her quiet dignity, her selfless kindness to a stranger who could offer her nothing in return. The treaty document was distributed to each lord, its official seals in elegant script representing the power to decide thousands of fates with the stroke of a quill. King Harold's expectations were clear. Swift signatures from all major lords would legitimize the agreement and spare the nobility from Aldrich's wrath. "We shall reconvene tomorrow for the formal signing," the king announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "I trust there will be no delays in this matter of such urgent importance to our realm's survival." Edmund returned to his chambers carrying the treaty like a man bearing his own death warrant. Alone in his ornate room, he spread the parchment across his mahogany desk and studied its contents with growing horror. The formal language could not disguise what it truly represented, the systematic destruction of families like those he had glimpsed in Marion's world. For the first time in his privileged life, Edmund faced a moral crisis where his conscience warred directly against political expedience. The comfortable assumptions that had guided his entire existence suddenly crumbled like castles built on sand. The treaty deadline loomed over him like an executioner's blade, demanding a choice between his comfortable position and his newly awakened soul. While Edmund wrestled with his conscience in the castle's upper chambers, Marion began noticing troubling changes in the atmosphere around her. The castle buzzed with an energy she had never felt before, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when servants approached, messengers arriving at all hours with urgent dispatches, and a tension among the staff that made everyone jumpy as startled rabbits. Her sharp mind, honed by years of careful observation necessary for a servant's survival, began piecing together fragments of overheard information. The kitchen maid spoke in hushed tones about increased military activity near the borders. The stable boys mentioned extra horses being prepared for long journeys. Even the normally talkative laundrywomen worked in unusual silence, their faces drawn with worry. It was while cleaning the corridors near the scribe's quarters that Marion first heard the name Lord Aldrich mentioned in fearful whispers. The young clerk who spoke it quickly crossed himself, as if the very words might summon evil spirits. From scattered conversations, she learned of treaties and negotiations, of demands that made grown men pale with fear. But it was the kitchen gossip that truly alarmed her. Cook Margaret, whose sister lived in the village of Westmere, had received word that families there were hiding their young men in root cellars and barn lofts. Rumors spread like plague about Lord Aldrich's previous conquests, where entire villages had been stripped of their sons and fathers for his armies. "They say he takes every man between 15 and 40, whispered Sarah the scullery maid, her voice trembling, "leaves behind only the very old and the very young to starve through winter." Marion's heart clenched as she thought of the families she knew in her own village. Young Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice, barely 17, with dreams of marrying the baker's daughter. Old Henrik's grandson, the only one left to work their small farm after disease, claimed his brothers. The widow Eliza's twin sons, her only protection against poverty and despair. Each name that came to mind carried a face, a story, a web of connections that would be shattered if such terrible news proved true. These weren't abstract concepts or political calculations. They were real people with hopes and fears, loves and losses, just like her own family. The golden quill slipped from Edmund's nerveless fingers, clattering against the stone floor with a sound like thunder in the sudden stillness. He stared at this common girl who possessed nothing but her moral convictions, yet wielded them with more authority than any royal decree or noble birthright. "You dare," he began, but the words died in his throat as he saw the tears glistening in her eyes, tears not of fear for herself, but of anguish for the countless innocents whose lives hung in the balance. "I know what this document means, my lord," Marian continued, her voice gaining strength like a river swelling with spring rain. "I know of the families who would be torn apart, the children who would lose their fathers, the wives who would become widows before their time." Edmund felt his carefully constructed world of political necessity crumbling around him as Marian spoke of specific people. The blacksmith's son who supported his aging parents, the young farmer planning to wed his beloved in the spring, the widow's only remaining boy who worked dawn to dusk to keep his mother from starvation. Her words transformed the abstract concept of peasant conscription into a parade of human faces, each one representing hopes destroyed and dreams shattered on the altar of political convenience. She painted pictures so vivid that Edmund could almost see these families himself, real people with beating hearts and loving souls, not the faceless resources his fellow nobles considered them to be. "Why do you risk everything for strangers?" Edmund asked, his voice hoarse with emotion he had never allowed himself to feel. "Because those with power have sacred duty to protect those without it," Marian replied simply. "And because every person matters, my lord, whether they wear silk or sackcloth." In that moment, Edmund realized he stood face to face with true nobility. Edmund stared at Marian, no longer seeing a servant, but recognizing a person of extraordinary character who embodied everything true nobility should represent. The treaty's ornate parchment suddenly appeared not as political necessity, but as an instrument of moral cowardice, its elegant script mocking every principle he had claimed to uphold. For the first time in his sheltered existence, Edmund faced someone whose ethical clarity cut through all his sophisticated justifications like a blade through silk. The weight of his privileged position, which had always felt like inherited right, now pressed down upon him as genuine responsibility for the lives of people he had never bothered to truly see. "Tell me more of these families," Edmund said quietly, sinking into his chair as if the burden of understanding had grown too heavy to bear standing. Marian's eyes lit with desperate hope as she spoke of her village, with the intimate knowledge that only comes from truly caring about people. She told him of the widow Eliza, struggling to raise 3 young sons after her husband died in a farming accident, dependent entirely on her eldest boy's wages from the mill. She described Thomas the blacksmith's apprentice, whose skill with hammer and anvil supported not only himself, but his master's failing health and his sweetheart's ailing father. Each story she shared transformed abstract political calculations into flesh and blood reality. These weren't numbers on a parchment or resources to be allocated. They were human beings with dreams, fears, and connections that bound entire communities together like threads in a tapestry. "But surely you understand," Edmund said, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices, "that refusing this treaty means defying the king himself. It could cost me my lands, my title, perhaps even my life." Marian nodded solemnly, her eyes reflecting deep understanding of the terrible position he faced. "I know the price you would pay, my lord. But what price will your soul pay if you sign? What manner of man will you be when you wake each morning knowing you chose comfort over conscience?" Her words struck him like physical blows, each one exposing the hollowness of the justifications he had been crafting in his mind. Edmund realized that this humble maid possessed more wisdom about true leadership than all his educated advisors combined, more courage than the bravest knights in the realm. "You would have me risk everything for people I barely know?" he asked. "I would have you be the man I glimpsed that day in the market," Marian replied softly. "The one who asked about protecting the innocent, who understood that real nobility means serving others rather than oneself." Edmund felt tears threatening for the first time since childhood, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was asking, and by the growing certainty that she was absolutely right. "The nobles have never witnessed the consequences of their choices," Edmund realized with growing clarity. "They live completely removed from the daily struggles of common people, making decisions about lives they've never bothered to understand." Marian nodded eagerly, her fear giving way to hope as she saw his genuine commitment to finding justice. If they could meet the families who would suffer, hear their stories, see their faces, surely some would choose differently. It was a radical idea that challenged every foundation of how power operated in their world. Lords simply did not consult with peasants about matters of state. The social order demanded that those of noble birth make decisions for those beneath them without seeking their input or understanding their concerns. Yet as they discussed the possibility, both began to see the wisdom in bridging the vast gulf between ruler and ruled. Edmund's authority could provide the means, while Marian's connections among the common folk could provide the voices that needed to be heard. It would be dangerous beyond measure, Edmund warned, his voice heavy with the weight of potential consequences. If discovered, we could both face charges of sedition for conspiring against royal policy. And if we do nothing, Marian replied softly, hundreds of innocent people will die for the crime of being born poor. Their unlikely partnership represented something entirely new, a bridge between the powerful and powerless, suggesting that true solutions required both authority and understanding, privilege and wisdom working together. As Edmund and Marian worked frantically to prevent the treaty's ratification, political pressure mounted from every direction like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. King Harold's patience grew thinner with each passing hour, his messengers arriving at Edmund's chambers with increasingly urgent demands for the signed document. The royal seal on each new message seemed to burn brighter red, as if heated by the king's mounting fury. Meanwhile, Lord Aldrich's threats escalated beyond mere political posturing into specific promises of devastation. His latest correspondence described in chilling detail what would befall any kingdom that dared refuse his reasonable requests. Tales reached the court of villages in neighboring realms that had been reduced to ash and bone for similar defiance. Other nobles questioned Edmund's hesitation with growing suspicion and contempt. Lord Blackwood cornered him after morning prayers, his voice dripping with barely concealed accusation. "Your delay puzzles us all, Edmund. Surely you don't believe peasant lives worth more than the stability of our entire realm." The court buzzed with whispered speculation about Edmund's unusual behavior, with some suggesting he had taken ill, others wondering if grief had addled his judgment. None suspected the truth, that their peers struggled with something as foreign to them as conscience. Meanwhile, Marian faced increasingly dangerous scrutiny from castle staff, who noticed her unprecedented access to Lord Edmund's private chambers. Master Aldwyn watched her movements with hawk-like intensity, while other servants whispered among themselves about the cleaning maid who spent far too long in the lord's quarters. "Strange, isn't it?" murmured Sarah the scullery maid, her eyes narrowing as she watched Marian hurry past with fresh linens. "A simple chamber cleaning shouldn't require such frequent attention." Edmund realized that protecting Marian while pursuing their desperate plan required careful navigation through treacherous waters of court intrigue. He arranged for her to receive special assignments that would justify her presence in noble quarters, organizing his library, maintaining his tapestries, tasks that required both discretion and extended time in his chambers. The weight of deception pressed heavily upon them both. Every conversation had to be carefully staged, every meeting disguised as normal servant duties. They communicated through coded messages hidden beneath everyday tasks, discussions of cleaning schedules that actually planned secret meetings with villagers, requests for fresh candles that signaled urgent developments. Time slipped away like water through cupped hands. Each sunset brought them closer to the moment when Edmund would have no choice but to sign or face the full wrath of royal authority. Both understood that failure meant not just political catastrophe, but the destruction of hundreds of innocent lives. With time running desperately short before the king's final ultimatum, Edmund and Marian executed their most perilous gambit yet, organizing a clandestine meeting with village leaders and families who would face conscription under the treaty's brutal terms. The enormous risk could not be overstated. If discovered, Edmund would face charges of sedition for conspiring with commoners against explicit royal policy. Marian proved invaluable in arranging the secret gathering, using her extensive network among castle servants to discreetly contact village representatives. Through whispered conversations while drawing water, coded messages passed during market visits, and careful word spread through trusted friends, she managed to reach those who needed to be heard most. The meeting location posed another challenge, somewhere remote enough to avoid detection, yet accessible to frightened villagers who feared traveling far from home after dark. They settled on the ruins of an abandoned monastery that had stood empty since plague claimed its inhabitants decades earlier. The crumbling stone walls would provide shelter from prying eyes, while the location's sacred history might offer some protection from supernatural fears that kept most people away. Edmund struggled with the magnitude of what he was attempting. This wasn't merely defying royal will. It was fundamentally challenging the social order that placed noble convenience above common welfare, that treated peasants as resources rather than people deserving of voice in their own fate. "If we're discovered," he warned Marion as they finalized their preparations, "you must claim I forced your participation. Say I threatened your position, your family, anything that might save your life." "And leave you to face the consequences alone?" Marion shook her head firmly. "We chose this path together, my lord. Whatever comes, we'll meet it with clear consciences." Meanwhile, Marion confronted her own fears about the enormity of their undertaking. A servant girl, involving herself in affairs of state, was treason beyond question. Discovery would mean certain death, possibly after torture, to extract information about other conspirators. Yet every time doubt crept into her thoughts, she remembered the faces of families who would be destroyed if they failed. The preparations required extraordinary care to avoid detection by royal spies who watched for any sign of unrest or rebellion. Messages had to be passed through multiple intermediaries, meeting times communicated through seemingly innocent requests for prayer at various village shrines, travel routes planned to avoid main roads where guards might question nocturnal movements. As the appointed night approached, both Edmund and Marion understood that everything depended on the next few hours. Their desperate plan represented the final hope for finding a solution that would protect innocent lives while avoiding the political catastrophe that outright defiance would bring. The clandestine meeting unfolded at the ruined monastery under a moonless sky, where crumbling stone walls and broken arches provided essential cover for this extraordinary gathering. Village representatives arrived quietly through hidden paths and forgotten routes. Elderly farmers whose weathered hands had worked the same fields for decades, young mothers whose husbands labored to support growing families, skilled craftsmen whose trades formed the backbone of their communities. Edmund, dressed in simple homespun clothes to avoid recognition, positioned himself in the shadows of what had once been the monastery's nave. As the villagers entered this sacred space, their faces etched with fear and hope in equal measure, he felt the weight of their trust settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility he had never truly understood before. The first to speak was Henrik, an aging blacksmith whose gnarled hands bore the scars of 40 years at the forge. "My lord," he began hesitantly, his voice echoing off ancient stones, "my grandson is all that remains of our bloodline. His father and uncles died in the fever 3 winters past. If you take him for this war—" His words trailed off, but the unspoken ending hung in the air like smoke from dying embers. Without the boy's strong back and skilled hands, the forge would fall silent, the village would lose its only smith, and an old man would face his final years in poverty and despair. A young woman named Catherine stepped forward, her infant son sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the cold night air. "My husband works the mill, my lord. We've been wed but 2 years, and this little one has never known a day without his father's voice singing him to sleep. Please, I beg you, don't make him grow up wondering why his papa never came home." Each personal story that followed struck Edmund's heart like hammer blows against an anvil. Thomas, barely 18, spoke of his plans to marry the baker's daughter in the spring, their small cottage already prepared with furniture he had crafted himself. The widow Eliza described how her eldest son's wages from the granary were all that stood between her younger children and starvation. From the shadows of a servant's alcove, Marion witnessed the terrible cost of moral courage. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the guards drag away the man whose conscience had cost him everything he once possessed. Edmund's eyes found hers for one brief moment across the chaos, and he nodded slightly. a gesture conveying that he harbored no regret for his choice, despite its devastating consequences. News of Edmund's arrest spread through the castle and beyond, like wildfire in dry grass, creating shockwaves among nobility who could not comprehend such sacrifice. In the great hall, lords gathered in clusters, their voices buzzing with disbelief and condemnation. "The fool has thrown away everything for peasant sentiment," Lord Blackwood declared, shaking his head in disgust. "Such madness serves as warning to us all about the dangers of consorting with common folk." Yet other nobles spoke in hushed tones of grudging admiration, even as they publicly condemned his judgment. Lord Hartwell, despite his earlier support for the treaty, found himself questioning whether he would demonstrate similar courage when his own conscience was tested. Meanwhile, Marian faced immediate peril as castle officials launched thorough investigations into everyone who had accessed Edmund's chambers. Master Aldwin questioned her repeatedly about her cleaning duties, searching for evidence of conspiracy or sedition. "What conversations did you overhear?" he demanded, his eyes boring into her face like hot coals. "What papers did you see? What treasonous words passed between you?" Marian maintained perfect composure despite her terror, claiming ignorance of political matters while grieving silently for the nobleman whose moral courage had transformed them both. Edmund's arrest and the heroic story behind it began spreading throughout the kingdom like ripples from a stone cast into still water, creating consequences no one had anticipated. The villagers he had met at the secret monastery gathering, deeply moved by his willingness to sacrifice everything for their protection, began speaking openly about the treaty's fundamental injustice despite the obvious risks to themselves. Word traveled from village to village through merchants, traveling priests, and wandering minstrels who carried tales of the lord who chose conscience over crown. In taverns and market squares, common folk whispered about Edmund's stand with growing admiration and hope. Here was proof that not all nobles viewed peasant lives as expendable resources. The story gained power with each telling, how Lord Edmund had risked everything to protect families he barely knew, how he had chosen moral courage over political convenience, how he now languished in the king's dungeon for the crime of defending the innocent. Soon, entire communities began questioning why they should accept conscription when even a lord found it unconscionable. Other nobles, initially dismissive of Edmund's foolish idealism, found themselves confronted by uncomfortable questions from their own subjects. Servants asked whether their masters would show similar courage when tested. Farmers wondered aloud why noble blood should be more precious than common blood. Even loyal retainers began examining their lords with new scrutiny. Lord Hartwell discovered this shift firsthand when his own steward approached him with unusual boldness. "My lord, the people ask whether you would have signed such a treaty. They wonder if you value their lives as Lord Edmund did." The question haunted Hartwell through sleepless nights, forcing him to confront moral questions he had never considered. Similar conversations occurred in castles throughout the realm, as Edmund's example challenged the very foundations of how nobility viewed their responsibilities. Meanwhile, Marian endured intense interrogation about her role in Edmund's decision, but her apparent simplicity and convincing denials persuaded investigators that she was merely an unwitting witness. Master Aldwin's questions grew increasingly frustrated as he failed to uncover evidence of conspiracy. "A simple serving maid could not influence matters of state," he concluded dismissively, never imagining that moral courage required no noble breeding or political education. Reports of growing unrest reached King Harold's court with alarming frequency. Peasants in multiple regions refused to report for military service, citing Edmund's example as justification for their defiance. What had seemed like a simple matter of royal authority was transforming into a broader crisis of legitimacy. The political situation grew more complex daily as the kingdom discovered that conscience could be more powerful than commands. In the most unprecedented turn of events in the kingdom's history, the mounting popular support for Edmund and increasing pressure from conscience-stricken nobles forced King Harold to completely reconsider the entire political situation. Reports of potential widespread rebellion flooded the royal court daily, while several lords privately expressed newfound respect for Edmund's moral courage, creating complications the king had never anticipated when issuing his arrest orders. The breaking point came when Lord Hartwell, followed by 3 other major nobles, formally requested an audience with the king to discuss the treaty's implications. Standing before the throne with uncharacteristic humility, Hartwell spoke words that would have been unthinkable mere days earlier. "Your Majesty, Lord Edmund's sacrifice has opened our eyes to truths we had long ignored. Perhaps we have been too hasty in our willingness to trade innocent lives for our own security." King Harold, faced with the very real possibility of civil unrest and the moral awakening of his own nobility, found himself trapped by his own rigid position. After days of intense deliberation and urgent consultations with advisors who warned of complete social upheaval, the king made a decision that amazed the entire realm. In a proclamation that sent shockwaves through every corner of the kingdom, King Harold announced Edmund's full pardon and the immediate suspension of treaty negotiations with Lord Aldrich. More stunning still, he declared that the kingdom would face Aldrich's armies with unified resolve, rather than purchasing peace through the sacrifice of innocent blood. "Let it be known," the royal decree proclaimed, "that this realm values the lives of all its people, from the highest lord to the humblest peasant. We shall not purchase our safety with their suffering." Edmund emerged from the dungeon to find himself not only restored to his lands and title, but elevated to a position of unprecedented moral authority within the kingdom. His willingness to sacrifice everything for principle had paradoxically strengthened the realm's political position by demonstrating that true leadership required moral courage rather than mere political calculation. The king publicly acknowledged that Edmund's conscience had prevented a grave injustice and established revolutionary new policies requiring all lords to consider their subjects' welfare in major decisions. The very foundations of noble governance shifted as duty to the people became as important as loyalty to the crown. Edmund and Marion's partnership, forged in crisis and sustained by shared commitment to justice, evolved into a new model of leadership that bridged social classes through moral principle. Together, they visited the villages whose families Edmund's choice had protected, with Marion helping him understand the daily lives of people whose welfare now rested in his hands. Their remarkable story became legend throughout the kingdom and beyond, inspiring future generations to choose conscience over convenience and proving that moral courage, however humble its origins, could indeed change the world when ordinary people found extraordinary strength to do what was right.